Welcome to the EXCELcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Kuskiski, and today my guests are the Aizuri Quartet, who are here in residence for an entire week, culminating in a performance under UMS auspices, where they will also be working with a number of our students in SMTD. Thank you so much for being here to spend some time talking with us today, and I want to welcome all of you individually. So Miho Segosa, Ayane Kozasa, Karen Uzunian, and Ariana Kim. I did pretty well that time, right?
Perfect.
Great.
Yeah.
So it's such a pleasure to have you here working with our students and to spend a little time talking about not only your career as a chamber ensemble, a string quartet, the grand prize winners of the 2018 M Prize, but also to talk a little bit about the ways in which you are carving out sort of a unique identity in the realm of chamber music. So let's start by jumping right in. Let's talk about your name. Where does the Aizuri Quartet come from? What was the inspiration, the origins of your name?
So I'll start. The word Aizuri comes from a form of Japanese woodblock printing, Aizuri-e, which is really detailed, vibrant, and uses shades of blue ink. And this was a type of ink, Prussian blue ink, that was imported to Japan in the 19th century. And it has this incredible story of sort of migration of ideas. And we just love the sound of the word, and we felt that it had a nice synergy with music making.
Absolutely, it's beautiful. We can keep talking about that. It brings to mind sort of something that I've observed about sort of the way that I think your identity at least could be broadcast or perceived, which is that you're sort of straddling two worlds in a way, right? You're obviously furthering this great legacy of the string quartet, but you're also paving the way for the future of the string quartet. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you approach that, which is somewhat unique to a degree in the realm of chamber music and probably presents certain opportunities but also challenges. So how do you think about that in terms of that as a dual identity or the dual task of your work?
I can start.
Yeah.
I think for us, there's this word that continues to come up for us, which is symbiosis, and that our love and our dedication, and we came upon the string quartet as a concept as young kids through composers like Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven, and as you get older and your horizons broaden and things become wider, you get exposed to so many other composers, so many other types of music that's written for the string quartet. And so our idea in thinking about new music and how that relates to our tradition and our sort of roots, all being classically trained in Western art music, is that we want to approach every single one of those new pieces in the same way that we approach a Beethoven quartet or a Bartók quartet. The same sort of marination, the same sort of digestion, unpacking, dissection, all of that happens in a similar way for us, no matter what the piece is. And that ideally, as we get to know these modern pieces that were written either for us or really recently, they have a really long life, that it's not, okay, we learned this one piece for the premiere and now we're done. But rather it goes through many evolutions, and that we revisit it, we see it in this context, we record it, we take it on tour, and that was, for us, I think there's a link back to how the study of that new music inspires our old music, that, when we explore a brand new piece that was written by Evgeny Charlot, how does, a rhythmic nugget that he wrote, how does that impact the way we play Bartók? And when we think about this passage in a Haydn quartet and its sort of its liveliness and its buoyancy, how do we apply that to a new piece by Caroline Shaw? So I think it's a very symbiotic relationship, and one that we try to make the same no matter what we're studying.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something that Miho once said, which was treating the string quartet as a living art. So we have this history, we hope to keep that alive, that tradition, but we also are so eager to keep it going and push forward and see what else is possible. Yeah.
Well, I love those two words, or the two phrases. You used the word symbiosis and you talked about living arts, and so that strikes me as to say that you don't necessarily view new music as a fundamentally different thing than canonical music. You're just inspired and interested in the connections between the composers and their works, and are looking for compelling ways to couple those works. Because I think one of the challenges I'm sure many groups face is how to couple the old and the new together. And it sounds like you're very thoughtful and intentional about that. I'd love to hear some other examples or thoughts about how you program and how you think about putting together those programs that make them compelling to audiences.
Sure. So I think that is one of the interesting challenges is, how to program the newer pieces.
Yeah.
And I think we've been really interested in finding ways to create a whole program, not just like thinking about just the pieces that are on the program, and to create one experience from beginning to end.
Yeah.
And so I think one cool part of playing a lot of these newer pieces that we have in our repertoire over many years and in many concerts is that we found interesting places to put them in paired with different pieces on different programs. And I think that's what spending the time with the pieces has allowed us to do, is to imagine how it would sound with a late Beethoven quartet, or how it might sound next to something else, and to kind of have fun with those pairings.
Well, I would love to hear a little bit about how that applies to the concert you'll be doing coming up this week at UMS. Do I understand it right, the second half has some newer works? Can you talk a little bit about that program in general and how you put it together?
Sure.
Yeah, two of the pieces on the program are from our album. Two, yeah. And one is Blueprint by Caroline Shaw, and then Lift by Paul Bianco. And the other two pieces are Bartok, String Quartet No. 2, and Komitas Vartaped's Armenian songs. And that's a really cool pairing right there, because Bartok is, as we all know, well known for recording all the folk songs of his home country, and not only recording them, but also digesting them and making it into his own voice, and really living with those pieces or those songs.
Yeah.
And Komitas was kind of the Armenian father of collecting all Armenian songs in his country, and then who made them into a string quartet?
Sergei Aslamazyan did these particular arrangements.
But hearing these two composers and how they interpret the folk songs in their own way is really neat to hear back to back. Yeah.
And then the second half, as Ayane mentioned, are these two works that were written for the quartet, and these are works from our album Blueprinting that we just released really recently.
Yeah, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, can we, so when you're thinking about a program like this one, and I mean, you have many programs on the season, and I'm sure you have lots of repertoire that you're trying to work in compelling ways. How does that work? I mean, I'm imagining you're in conversation with the presenter and they have some say. What are you thinking about when you go to a presenter? Do you have a fixed number of programs? Do you have maybe a larger group of repertoire that you can kind of meld and adjust sort of standard programs? How do you go about that piece of it?
I think it's multifaceted,
Yeah.
that process. We often begin our programming process with we use music that we love as a starting point, or composers that we find super interesting, or we're really eager to work with. So there's already this passion for all that music, and I think that's often quite compelling to a presenter, or that could feel kind of contagious, and they might then be willing to come along and say, yeah, we'd love to program your idea because you're really passionate about it. Sometimes, we've written program notes about conceptual programs that presenters find really helpful or interesting for their audiences, to help them kind of have a way into the thought process behind that particular program.
Interesting. So, and you mentioned your album. I want to talk a little bit more about that as well. But that, what you just mentioned about sort of conceptual programming, it strikes me that a great example of how you've done that would have been your residency at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, 2017-18, where I understand you curated 5 programs. Could you talk a little bit about, first of all, what that experience was like? It sounds amazing, and how much degree did you have, or flexibility did you have to come up with programs, and how did you go about making those decisions?
So it was incredibly free. We pretty much had free reign to come up with our dream programs, and they were really helpful about, if a piece needed tech, or if there was a collaboration involved, what the collaborator needed for the piece, and I think we were able to learn from that experience, like what about the programming process we liked, and we went about it in different ways. We started with pieces that we love. We also started with a concept or an idea and went from there and found kind of music that we thought would kind of tell that story in a really interesting way. Yeah,
and it, as Miho mentioned, like there were collaborations involved or tech requirements for certain pieces. A piece by Gubaidulina that had a whole lighting component, and that was something that the Met could really, it was an opportunity for us to explore, for us to stretch what we were able to try and repertoire that we were able to learn. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
When you think, I mean, you used the word collaboration, and obviously there are many different ways in which you have collaborated as a group with other artists. But I imagine that there's a level of collaboration in this example too, with the venue, the presenter. There's a conceptual component that they're hoping you will bring to the table to assist them, right? And so I would love to get your sense of, when you think about collaboration, what are the different ways in which that manifests itself? I mean, do you have one-off collaborations? Do you think about long-term collaborations with composers when they're, maybe if you can give an example of a particular project, or the Music and Migration project, or others where you've done collaborations and how those have kind of unfolded for you.
I think the Music and Migration is a great example. So we wanted to showcase in that program how different composers approached this idea of immigration or migration, how that can manifest in music, or in the drama of the music and the kind of sound world you live in. And so for that particular project, we asked 4 composers to create a mini, well, we call it a micro commissions, a suite of micro commissions, where we asked each person, each quartet member picked a composer that they really wanted to work with, and we asked them to write these short pieces based on this theme and interpret it any way they liked. And so one of the composers of that suite is Michi Bianco, and next spring, she's going to be writing a chamber opera for us based on the tale of Genji. So this is like a beautiful, I think, example of a collaboration that started in a very mini form, and then we can take it now to a much bigger scale project, and that'll also be at the Met Museum.
Oh, that's very exciting.
We're
So
excited about that.
on 2 fronts, a continuation of collaboration there with the composer and also
With the venue.
the space.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about what it's like to play those concerts at the museum. I mean, were they in different spaces? That seems like there's a layer of flexibility or opportunity there to connect the physical spaces in which you're playing with the programmatic idea. So I'd love to hear about how you approached that piece of it.
Yeah, so the season was bookended. The first and last concert were in their main performance space, the Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium, which is this beautiful, iconic space to play in. And that's on the main campus on Fifth Avenue, the big museum. And then in the center of the residency was this concert that we did featuring the Haydn 7 Last Words of Christ. And that was actually up at the Met Cloisters, which is kind of a magical space way up at the northern tip of Manhattan. And there's this sort of recreated Spanish chapel called the Fuente de Duena Chapel. And it has this incredible crucifix that hangs from the ceiling, and there are these beautiful stained glass windows, and it sort of feels like you're being transported back several hundred years in the past, and it's incredibly resonant. The space is just this kind of big cavern in a beautiful way, and I think the audience also got to kind of experience that piece in an incredibly visceral sort of dimension. You didn't have the sort of, as we think of classical concerts now on a stage with, sort of seats facing the stage and it's sort of in a rectangle.
Mm-hmm.
This was more sort of circular, and behind us was this sort of ovular shape, and so that was that concert. And then the other two were back on the main campus, but in different spaces in the museum outside of the main auditorium. Our Japan Across the World program took place in Astor Court, which is sort of an Asian art space. It's modeled after Chinese architecture and was built by various Japanese artists and builders. And our Music in Isolation program was in a separate space in the museum, actually within a gallery that they sort of built a temporary stage. And so it was cool to sort of be nomadic within the world of the Met.
Right. I mean, it sounds just like an amazing kind of sandbox to be playing in creatively. You mentioned the isolation program, and I'd love to talk just for a moment about that, because I understand, was Beethoven on that program? Can you talk a little bit about how you approached isolation, the concept of isolation? Because, I mean, it's in some ways, it makes, I can see it makes sense, but on the other hand, the music's such a social, communicative art. So I'd love to hear about how you tackled that dimension of programming.
Yeah, it was a really neat program concept. It was just composers who, how these composers kind of use their creativity in different forms of isolation to create music. And Beethoven was an aural isolation.
Right.
We played Grosse Fugue, and at that point he was completely deaf. And Hildegard von Bingen, the abbess, the mystic of the 11th century. Just imagining how isolated she was as a woman composing all this chant music. And then the Conlon Nancarrow was one of the zanier composers that we got to play, and it was so fun. But he was politically isolated and lived in Mexico. And then we also had Haydn, who we imagined what was his life like being in the Esterhazy court, and just
fascinating.
Yeah, turning out music and writing all these pieces. And then also Carlo Gesualdo was on that program.
Wow.
So
it's a great example of thinking about the sort of multiple dimensions of how one can experience a concept. It makes me think, as you were speaking about the spaces, that you're really thinking about the concert experience as a sort of in an immersive way, so that for audiences might come because they just love that Beethoven, right? But they're going to be exposed to all this other music, and it seems like all of this thoughtful sort of curation that you're doing about the space and the through lines of storytelling might help, right? It might help somebody who doesn't know Nancarrow to be more open in that moment to receiving, the totality of what that Nancarrow has to offer, not just how it sounds in that first moment. Is that fair to say?
Totally.
Yeah. So great. So I don't want to switch gears too much, but it seems like the album that has just come out is a more recent example of this kind of work too. Can you talk a little bit about what's on the album? Just tell us all about it.
Sure. So this is our debut album. It's called Blueprinting, and it's because it's our debut. We wanted to put together a collection of pieces that were particularly meaningful for us. So these are all pieces. There are 5 composers featured on the program: Caroline Shaw, Lembit Beecher, Paul Lianco, Yevgeny Charlotte, and Gabriella Smith. And they're all pieces that were written for our quartet, and that we spent a lot of time sort of workshopping or performing or touring and just sort of living with over many years. So that was why we were drawn to these pieces. We found them to be really remarkable pieces. And the idea of blueprinting, of planning something and building something that takes a long time was something really meaningful to us. And New Amsterdam was really excited about releasing it, so we're super grateful to them.
That's great. Well, and I love the metaphor too of blueprinting for or as you were talking about, this idea of iteration and how you build momentum over a long period towards bigger projects, and that's a metaphor for any ensemble, right? But a quartet for sure. So we'll keep an eye out for the CD. But I want to talk also a bit about sort of thinking about that momentum. You've had this big victory at the M Prize, and you're touring all over the place. You're very active, but you also have other activities that feed your musical souls. And we talked about it earlier as sort of different pieces of a musical pie that is individual for each of you. And rather than going into like all the nitty-gritty of what that is, I'd love to talk a little bit about how you balance, those different pieces. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the model, how often you're spending time together and how you kind of make momentum, move forward on these different projects given where you are right now as a quartet. How does it work?
It's always a jigsaw puzzle, it's a puzzle to kind of fit all of these things, because we want to give each other the opportunity to, if a project comes up that's really exciting, we don't want to say no.
Yeah.
So we definitely try to carve out as much time as we can together as a quartet, so that we have the time to rehearse and to feel good about our next program, and to take it on the road, and have also as many performances as we can. And then we also, I think, strongly believe that all of our outside, individual projects end up feeding into the quartet. Like we learn, what we learn from playing together as a quartet, we can take to these individual projects, and then these new experiences that we might have when we're away from the quartet, we can then bring back to the quartet. So that's how we think about the other parts of the musical pie.
Well, that's great. It's a very positive way to frame it too, because I think we've done so many episodes now. We hear the story over and over again. For each different group or artist, you have to develop a model that really works for you, right? For the four superheroes in your group, leveraging your particular skills and interests, and leveraging technology, frankly, to make planning and everything happen more remotely. But it's great. I'm loving the positivity with which you frame the busyness that must pervade all of your lives. And I wish we had more time to talk, but I really want to thank you all for spending some time to share your work with us today. We're looking forward to the concert and to following your work for the years to come.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
so much.
you.